Do we want to just go in the order that's in the program?
Yeah, I think so. And I will kick us off. So, for the recorded record, this is a session called Pop Culture Pedagogy, the Joys and Challenges of Teaching from a Popular Culture Perspective. And I am up first, so let me share that screen with you guys. I do apologize for the quality of my voice. It will probably not get better. This presentation is titled Whoa, Innovatively Teaching Transhumanism Through the Use of the Matrix and Other Sci-Fi Properties. And this came to be through the wonderful opportunity that I was afforded by Virginia Commonwealth University to teach a class on science fiction and the anthropology of transhumanism. It was super fun, but it was also very new and a little challenging in order to get across what my main teaching goals were for the semester, particularly with the disparate amount of sci-fi that I was using. Before we get into that, though, a little background on transhumanism. I'm not talking about the political movement. I am talking about the idea that we as a species in the Anthropocene are moving past the fleshy human body. So the question here, the central question is, what does it mean to be human? And of course, this is a question that is both central to anthropology, which is my primary discipline, and has both a lot of different answers and basically no answer whatsoever. Within that question, we ask the further questions, where does the human body begin and end? Our general answer to that question could be at the skin level, but with our ability to integrate technology into the body or to use the technology that we have to supplement this, we don't really have an answer to that question either. How do we know what it is to be human, where the body begins and ends, when we have things like glasses, which are a piece of technology that help us see and that we consider ubiquitous to the point we no longer even really think of them as assistive technology. And yet without them, we would all be pretty much lost. And then the second follow-up question is what defines personhood? Once we have a baseline for what it means to be a human being, where our body begins and ends, how are we then defining this idea of personhood? What it means to have humanity, what it means to act like a human being or to deserve the rights that all human beings deserve. In our age of teaching in the digital age, I think that authenticity matters. And so we go way back to these fundamental ideas of science fiction and this question of transhumanism. And I have here a property I actually didn't use in this class, which is Total Recall. Total Recall was a 1990 film with Arnold Schwarzenegger where he goes and visits a studio basically that will implant memories into you, and they will be so realistic that you can't really tell the difference. And then he, of course, goes on an adventure that is inspired by these memories, and the movie ends ambiguously. So the question becomes, is it real or is it recall? My answer to this question is, if it's not real, then it should be at least as good a facsimile as possible so that you feel that authenticity. The authenticity itself is what matters. We're no longer teaching in a butts in seats teaching environment. We have students who have a lot of things going on in their external lives. They have other commitments. They have this fundamental concept that school is only one of their priorities at this point. So, how do we get them involved and interested in education for the sake of it? How do we get them to buy into that authenticity, that experience of being in that classroom and learning from professors and from each other? So to start the class, I take us back to the basics with Frankenstein. Frankenstein is, of course, recognized as one of the first works, if not the first work, of science fiction. It has everything from explorations of gender roles to ideas about what it means to be human. And you have this juxtaposition of the creator and the created that really gets to the heart of transhumanism. We as humans create other humans, we do so biologically, but what happens when we purposefully take on that role of creation? When we take on that role of finding ways to build and change the next generation, which is something that we do as professors. We are building the ideas and the concepts and the realities of the next generation of students. And yet, in Frankenstein and in professorship, we have this ambiguous reality. We have this question of whether or not what Victor is saying is what the creature is experiencing, and who here is telling the truth. So, who defines that reality is really something that is also at the heart of the transhumanism movement. Next, I take them to the Matrix, and this is really about complicated simplicity. The Matrix is one of those movies that has become so fundamental. It is memed to an extreme, and we all know the basic principle of the Matrix. Humans are living in a simulation. That simulation is so detailed that your ordinary average human cannot tell the difference. And yet we never stop to question this idea of if the people who are in the Matrix, Neo and Trinity in this particular case, are in fact themselves human. We're told by the movie that they are. We're told by the movie that they are part of the human race, part of humanity. And yet at the same time, there is a distinction within the movie between two different types of humans. Those who have been in the Matrix and who have those plugs on their body, and those who were born in Zion and who don't have the plugs and don't have the ability to jack into the Matrix. So while the external humans could definitely tell that there is a difference between these two different types of humans and between the reality and the simulation, regular humans in the Matrix, humans who are living in that simulation, cannot tell the difference. So we're going to take this simplicity, this idea of either or, and we're going to complicate it by looking deeper into these sci-fi properties and asking students these questions that are so fundamental to this conception of transhumanism and anthropology, starting with this idea of who are you? What is your purpose? Are you, in fact, human? The Matrix also gives us several different things that it means to be human. Now, this is a particularly interesting quotation because it's a quotation that's actually being said about sex. To deny our impulses is to deny the very thing that makes us human. And the character in question, Mouse, is trying to get Neo to go off and have sex with the woman, with the lady in red. And yet, our impulses are so much more defined during the rest of the Matrix franchise, so much differently defined than just that sexual urge. We see kindness and generosity and caring and fellow feeling as humans and cyborgs alike go to help and save and care for the people around them. We see desire and excuse me, pair bonding and love and attraction, not just between Neo and Trinity, but also between other characters who do partake in that caregiving, in that affectionate relationship with the people around them. And we see protection and defense and mitigation, the ways in which the human body and the human mind can be used in a uniquely non-machine way, even if they are working with the machines, to really acknowledge that humanity and everybody else around them, protect, defend, and mitigate the harm that is done to their fellows. So again, we come back to this question, who are you? And for that, I have the students read a graphic novel called Unflattening. Unflattening by Nick Sutanis is a fascinating piece of work and should really be read like in the book form because it is so tactile and gorgeous. But the whole idea behind it is, excuse me, is this idea of unless you have the awareness of your nature, and your nature may be just a cog in a machine, just another grain of sand. Unless you have awareness of that, you don't have power. So it's really reinforcing that idea of the matrix, that you need to be aware that there is a doubled standard here, not a double standard, but a doubled standard. Power in this case, and we can go back to Foucault as well, equals the potential for change. Once you know that you are within a system, you can work within that system to change it. So while we're still talking about what it means to be human, how technology is integrated into the body, what is the next step in humanity, we're also talking about the steps that we're currently taking. We as students, we as teachers sitting there in that classroom are part of that system. And yet, once we become aware of that, we have the potential to change it for the better. One of our other properties is All Systems Red, which is the first book in the Murderbot series. I also played for them the first episode of the TV show Murderbot on Apple Plus. Excellently, excellently done. And here is more you see that interdependency of machines and the Anthropocene and us as human beings. I argue on the subject of transhumanism that we are far past that stage where we could uncouple ourselves from that dependence. We are so deeply involved in electricity, in mechanics, in computer systems, in medical systems that require all of this stuff that we cannot uncouple. So it can no longer be us versus them when it comes to machinery or mechanics. It has to be us versus them. Or I'm sorry, us and them. And yet, the humanity matters. Murderbot is inherently an actually good person, regardless of how they have been programmed. So they have taken that programming, broken it, and followed their own conscience. And it turns out their conscience is actually a good person. So humanity matters. This idea of building humanity into our technology comes back again with Ex Machina. And with Ex Machina, it comes back as a negative. So in this case, we are returning, as always, throughout this entire course, to this conception of Frankenstein, to the creator and the creation and the relationship between the two. In Frankenstein, excuse me, in Frankenstein, you get this idea that the creation is only looking for love and compassion. If it had gotten love and compassion, the outcome would have been much, much differently. And so you see with Ex Machina this idea of developing robotics to the point where it can inherently pass a Turing test. And yet there is no compassion either within the creation or within the creator themselves. And so when we talk about what it means to be human, we're not merely intellectual beings, we're also ethical beings. Yet, in order to be ethical beings, we need to put that equal consideration into the things we are creating, into that idea of teaching students in this particular situation, into this question of what it means to be human. You see here the creation stabbing her creator, and yet she is not the first one to stab in this particular instance. Her fellow creation, Kyoko, stabs the creator in the back first. Earlier in the movie, we get a scene where Kyoko is using that same knife to slice fish for sushi for lunch. And it's such a beautiful juxtaposition because you have this programming that made her able to make lunch, to use this knife in a very specific way, and yet never thought to program her against stabbing her creator. Ethical behavior requires equal consideration. It requires treating the things we create as though they are those human beings. And then we come to Cloud Atlas, which is the manufactured humanoids part, because we're not just incorporating mechanics into our body, we're also incorporating gene therapy. In Cloud Atlas, the replicants shown here on the screen are created to serve, and they do so very willingly up until one, with help, breaks her programming. They are programmed to do the same thing day in and day out, just as things like going to work, going to school, being a human being, being a cog in the machine can really feel like that day in, day out, same thing. But it does come down to this question, who are you? And what are you going to do with that awareness, with that knowledge? So how did it go, this experimental class? It went really, really well. It did lead to a better understanding of transhumanism. It did lead to a consensus that the simulation does not matter as long as you are acting as though that authenticity is there. And then, of course, we go back to Baudelaire and the simulation and simulacra. And this demonstration of humanity equals worthiness. When you are behaving as though you are human in a transhuman capacity, then you are demonstrating that humanity and you are worthy of being treated as such. We came to this class with very little expectation in terms of how to interact with each other, but we ended up with engaging examples, recursive lessons that built on each other, and a deeper examination of that core question of what it means to be human and who are we, which led to an overwhelming feeling of, whoa. Thank you very much. I will now pass the baton, so to speak, to Dr. Liz Faber with their presentation of English 358 to True Crime, aka Tricking Non-Majors into Literary Analysis.
Thank you. Full screen. There we go. All right. So, thank you, Rebecca. So I'm going to talk through the life cycle of this course, essentially, from kind of the context in which I created it, and then I've run it twice. So I'm going to talk about how we revised it as well. So, like Dr. Gibson said, I am Dr. Liz Faber. I am Associate Professor of English and Communication at Dean College. And I have been teaching a class on true crime literature. To give you some context, because I teach at an interesting school, Dean is an undergrad only small liberal arts college in Franklin, Massachusetts, which is a very small town. If you've ever been to Massachusetts, you know you can't spit without hitting a college or a university. So we are one of many slacks here. We have about 1,200 students, and our biggest majors are dance. That is by far our biggest. We have both a BA and a BFA. We also business communications and criminal justice. Within communications, sports broadcasting is pretty huge. So you'll notice none of these are humanities courses. They're all in arts or business or social sciences. So getting students interested in the humanities is always a challenge. Now, for our Gen Ed, within written and oral communication competencies, we have a sort of pathway that students take through it. At the 100 level, all our students take Comp 1 and Comp 2, and then Speech Comm, which is also communication fundamentals. At the 200 level, students take a ton of electives, but within humanities, they do a core distribution humanities class. They only have to do one. For us, we focus in on oral communication in the 200 level to help students bridge from the first level in speech comm into the 300 level, where all of our students across the college take applied professional communication. Also at the 300 level, our students take what we call UDLAs, which means Upper Division Liberal Arts classes. Every school has its own weird acronyms. This is one of ours. Students have to take 3 of these outside of their major, and they kind of span disciplines in the School of Liberal Arts. So a lot of what we do in the English department is teach these service classes, so at the 200 and 300 level. And then finally, leading up to the capstone, every student in every major has to do a capstone, and that always involves some sort of presentation, whether it's presenting as, sorry, I was checking the chat. Whether it's presenting a poster in the sciences and social sciences, also dance theater do poster projects because they're required to do research projects, or in the humanities, we do PowerPoint presentations, much like you would do for a conference. Hello, there we go. So why I developed this course, a bunch of reasons. So the first reason is we needed a creative nonfiction studies course in the English major. We had one on the books. It was memoir. It hadn't been taught in a while. And when it was taught, it wasn't very popular because students outside of the English major don't necessarily care about memoirs. So in addition, we wanted to address what all of us see at the college level, which is apathy about reading and literary analysis, right? If I'm going to be a dancer, why do I need to read 5 novels this semester? Why do I need to write a 15-page paper about a book? If I'm going to be in sports broadcasting, why do I have to learn about memoir, right? So part of what we wanted to do was capitalize on the true crime craze to get students interested and move them past that apathy. And then finally, on a technical level, we found that our students were really struggling by the time they got to the capstone level to do advanced writing. So we needed to build in more of that instruction at the 300 level. They were getting good oral comm instruction at the 200 level, but then we needed something to bridge the gap into capstone. So we added for all of our 300 level courses in the humanities, we added process writing. They have to read scholarly sources. They have to write a literature review where they synthesize at least 4 scholarly sources. And they have to write a 12 to 15-page thesis-driven essay. So the timeline for actually creating this course, in spring 2022, we did our assessment and we found some results that established the need. Over the summer, I submitted the course proposal as part of an omnibus of changes in the humanities as in response to that assessment project. It was approved in fall 2022. I did my first run in fall 23. As with every class you teach for the first time, it was a little bit of a disaster. And then I made a bunch of changes for fall. But that shift is really what I'm going to look at today. Now the description, I put all of this up on my website, so I'm going to kind of go through it quickly, but if you want to look at any of my materials, everything is at lizwfaber.com. So the description, I originally envisioned this course as speaking to students in the humanities, but also in pre-law and communication to think about media ethics, because we don't really have up to this point, we didn't have any kind of media theory classes in the comm major, so this would sort of help address that as well, while also getting students to think about literary genre. This is how we map out our learning goals. So all of our all-college goals are mapped onto our program learning goals, they're mapped onto our course-based learning goals. I'm not going to go through all of these, but suffice it to say, it's pretty bog standard stuff for critical thinking and creative problem solving, global and intercultural fluency, and effective communication. Again, all of this is on my website if you're interested in reading more. Okay, so the first run. The great things about it, it was at cap, which is 25 because our school is very small. So I'm very delighted to be able to teach such small, intimate classes, even for just general electives. And we were at cap from start to finish, which is pretty rare for a class like this. Students were super excited about the topic. We went on a really fun field trip, which I'll talk about in a second. And everything else about the class was kind of a mess. I had terrible low in-class participation. Students were just not interested in talking about the readings as a group. So that Socratic seminar style that we're used to at the 300 level did not work. My students had really surprisingly poor basic writing skills that I know for a fact that they learned in the first year, but didn't retain to the junior and senior year. So they were struggling to annotate the text. They were struggling with essay organization, writing a basic thesis statement, analysis. One of the most surprising things I found was that students stuck to summary over analysis. They didn't use the evidence sandwich, so I wound up having to sort of on the fly do a lot of in-class lessons on that. And they really struggled with the conclusions. Now, in addition, I found that my focus was really unclear. I was trying to squish in stuff about media and law and literature, and it was just way too much. And finally, I was very case-oriented instead of literature-oriented. So every text I had them read, we thought about the actual crime rather than how the case was being presented to us in the literature. So how I revised the class, the description and goals stayed the same, obviously, but the rest of it I really switched up. So starting with text, I decided to do the foundational text right from the beginning. So obviously I had to start with Truman Capote's In Cold Blood. It is really the foundation of the true crime genre. And it's interesting because he writes from an outsider's perspective, but pretends that he knows everything. So he really hides his process in it. Then we move to Helter Skelter. Sorry, these are visually out of order. Helter Skelter, which was written by Vincent Bugliosi with Kurt Gentry, and Bugliosi was the prosecutor on the Manson case. So this book is a first-person memoir, but it's very cold, very clinical, very, I am a lawyer, let me tell you about law things. And then we do The Stranger Beside Me by Anne Rule, which is about the author's friendship with the notorious serial killer Ted Bundy. So it is also a memoir, but it's much messier and much more personal than Helter Skelter. Then we do Serial, the podcast, which again was groundbreaking in the genre. And I stick to the first season because that was so important. Now, the first time I taught it, the final text was Better Not Bitter by Yusef Salaam, which is a wonderful memoir. Salaam was one of the Central Park Five, or the Exonerated Five, as they're known as now. But I found that a lot of the key themes we'd already covered in the class came up again in there, so students thought it was a little bit too repetitive. Plus, we are now launching a track in the English major on film studies. So I decided in 25 to switch over to The Thin Blue Line, the documentary, to sort of help garner some interest in the film studies track. And also, it's a foundational documentary in the genre. The secondary text I also switched up. Originally, I focused primarily on popular and scholarly sources because I thought students would have had enough foundation in reading scholarly sources at that point. I was wrong. And I really did things that kind of were disconnected from the final essay. So students read all these sources and then didn't use them in the final essay, which became kind of a problem. So when I revised, I focused more on textual analysis and genre analysis in true crime itself. I gave them pretty much all scholarly sources with the exception of a piece by Harold Chester, who is one of the most famous true crime writers. And I started with some foundational theory before moving into the actual text. On top of that, as I'll talk about in a second, for the final paper, I did it more process related, so students had to use the materials they were covering in class. The assignment weights were totally different. Originally, I was like, case reports, midterm, final, boom, we're done, that's it. And that was too narrow for my students. So I wound up in the revisions doing a completely flipped classroom where in class activities, we did these every single class period, and those were worth 20% of their grade. So, and I'll talk more about that in a second. Instead of having them cover serial as a unit, I had them listen to one episode per week and annotate it together. So they got that feeling of the serialized podcast, like all of us had when we listened to it when it first came out. They still had to do the analysis essays, but that became the foundation for the final essay. So I was doing more process writing. Now the case reports, you can see here, my initial description was just really bare bones. I was like, write some stuff. And that was a disaster. So I got much more specific with it. I mapped all of these kind of verbs that are underlined onto the rubric so that it was much clearer to students what my expectations were of them. And I added in a reflective aspect of it to reflect on their actual writing process, which made students think a lot more clearly about what it was that they were up to in the class to do that metacognitive level. The final essay, again, went from 45% to 30% in the weight. And originally, I had students pick a case that we hadn't covered in class, and that really encouraged them accidentally to just summarize a crime instead of doing textual analysis. So in the revisions, I had them take one of the texts that we covered and take one of their case analysis essays of it and just expand it into a 10 to 12 page essay. So they had to do more analytical work on something they'd already analyzed, and it worked way better. The in-class activities, again, this is something that I've been doing in all of my literature classes lately. The usual discussion-based courses don't work anymore. So I completely flip it. I'll do maybe 5 minutes of lecture just to give context to our discussion. But then the rest of it is students working in small groups. So even if students haven't done the readings, someone in their group has, and they can share out. And all of the activities require them to go back to the text. So if they haven't read it, they can at least find some passages to look at and understand the material. It is not what we literature professors love doing, which is accepting that students aren't going to do the readings. But I think it's important that we accept this and that we work with it so that students are still learning about the readings. And that encourages them to do deeper dives with it. So an example of my in-class activities, this is the one that students named as by far their favorite. So we start off with reading a section from Charlotte Barnes's wonderful book, Deconstructing True Crime Literature. There's lots of good terminology in there that we use throughout the semester. The instructions, I had them get into small groups, and I gave them an image of a crime scene, and they had to write different narratives based on different authorial proximities, accuracy, and authenticity. And this is the crime scene. So they had to write from, first of all, the point of view of the victim, who in this case is a hamburger, being sprayed by a tomato with ketchup, we assume, some sort of condiment. So that's a more proximal author. Then they had to tell the story from the point of view of someone who lives in the woods. So maybe a witness or somebody who's nearby, tangentially related to the crime. And finally, they had to write from the perspective of a journalist or some outsider's point of view so that they could think through, okay, how do I tell this story authentically and accurately while also thinking about whose perspective am I writing from? And then they had to do a little reflection on it. I also had them color, which they really loved. Surprisingly, students in their 20s love coloring, especially when we're about to talk about books with like quadruple homicide. They like the fun things. And then I got to decorate my office with their coloring. So win-win. Okay, so the weekly serial discussion, like I said, I split it up into week by week. I also used Hypothesis originally, which is a really great social annotation tool, but it is expensive. So I am now looking for alternatives for the next time I teach this class. The field trip was probably my favorite part of the course. I live just outside Boston. Our school is about an hour train ride from Boston. And as you may or may not know, there's been a lot of crime in Boston. So there are several really great historical true crime tours. The first one we went on, I did it as part of an assignment. So for the midterm, students could either go on the field trip and write a report, or they could write a report of an episode of Red Handed podcast. Either one was fine. My department paid for 8 tickets, and I think that first year we had 6 students go. The second time I ran it, I decided to split it off from an assignment just so it could be real academic enrichment for students. We did a different tour. Both were excellent, highly recommend. But only 3 students went because there was no credit attached to it. So I couldn't really garner the excitement about it that I had before. Understandable and pretty expected. Okay, so overall, the positives of the second run. This course is apparently one of the most popular classes in my college. It filled in the first hour of registration. There were like 17 people on the wait list throughout the entire summer. It was bonkers. So still really in high demand. I had amazing in-class participation because I did that flipped classroom. I was able to track their writing skills throughout the course because we were doing much more process writing. And I discovered they actually did a lot better in their projects. They learned more about the process. They got those advanced writing skills that they needed. I was also able to more clearly focus the class because I centered on nonfiction and true crime genre and that terminology rather than trying to think too big with it. And then the biggest thing that I didn't know students were getting out of it at the time, but I have heard from other colleagues that my students really dug into our discussions about what is truth, what is storytelling, how do we tell the truth in storytelling. And apparently a lot of them bring it up in their other classes now. I've had colleagues tell me. So that is an unexpected bonus of this. Now the negatives, not enough in-class writing time is what my students told me, and less incentive to attend the field trip. So those are things I can keep tweaking. But that is so far the life cycle of my course. So thank you. All of my course materials and this slide deck are up on my website. And if you want to talk more about the life cycle of courses, I am a policy and process wonk. So I would love that. Feel free to email me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Faber. That was so cool. I will now turn things over to Emily Hamilton-Honey, whose talk is titled Both Timely and Timeless: Teaching Young Adult Literature as Pop Culture of the Moment and as Literature that Transcends Time.
Right. And I do not have a pretty PowerPoint, but hopefully this will be interesting anyway. Since Liz was so good as to sort of contextualize her institution, I just wanted to take a minute at the beginning and say that I work at a very similar institution. SUNY Canton is technically a tech college for the SUNY system. We have about 3,000 students. We are undergraduate only. And we don't have a literature major per se. So I get anything from nursing to vet tech to engineering to game design, you name it. But students who are not, necessarily in a seminar just because they like literature. And so you have to find ways to get them to dig into it uh, without letting them realize that's what you're doing a lot of the time, I think. Um, so just a week ago, I gave a presentation at Canton in a micro course. We have this thing called Micro Course Mondays, where different people on the faculty present on their topics of choice. And my micro course was titled Nancy Drew in the Public Domain: Why We Still Love the Iconic Girl Sleuth. It struck me that this lecture about Nancy would also be the perfect intro for this presentation because it touched on all of the ideas that I wanted to highlight about teaching young adult literature. Saying that Nancy Drew is timeless seems so obvious that it almost doesn't require discussion. She's the longest running sleuth in literary history, aside from Sherlock Holmes. Even if a person cannot name a single other girl heroine from young adult literature, they can usually come up with Nancy Drew as an icon. She has had new adventures across 8 different series for nearly 100 years, covering 466 volumes. And the latest series, the Nancy Drew Diaries, is still ongoing and still being published by Simon and Schuster. However, what most people don't know about Nancy's continuing adventures is that they have been very deliberately crafted to be of the moment. The original Nancy Drew novels came out in the 1930s. The first 4 of these are now in the public domain. Adventures 1 through 34 were published from 1930 to 1956. And then Harriet Stratemeyer Adams, the head of the Stratemeyer Syndicate after her father Edward passed away, decided that Nancy needed updating. She proceeded to revise all 34 mysteries, changing plots, adding characters, and updating clothes, hair, cars, and other elements. All of the mysteries were cut from 25 chapters down to 20. Nancy was aged 18 instead of 16, and she became Titian-haired instead of blonde. The syndicate then added new stories after revising the original 34 and ran up to volume 56 in 1979. The trend continued when Nancy went paperback. Cases 57 to 175, which ran from 1979 till 2003, always reflected the cultural ideals and trends of the moment. Nancy's hair, clothes, cars, skills, and cases were always in tune with the world around her. It's the biggest reason why she has remained an icon for a century. Not because she never changes, but because of how she does, and because she always does. Her core qualities that make her Nancy remain constant, but everything else is changing with the times. This mini history of Nancy is, I think, emblematic of young adult literature as a field and of student reactions and analysis when I teach my young adult literature course every spring. Young adult lit is wildly popular among both its intended audience and adult readers, and yet within the academy, it is also often dismissed as pop culture drivel and literature that lacks meaning. Students who enroll in my course either come to it already knowing the genre or knowing nothing. There aren't very many who are in between. All of them end up being surprised by the breadth, depth, and complexity of the YA texts we study. They are also accustomed to thinking about young adult literature as ahistorical. And when I say that, I mean thinking about it without any historical or social or theoretical considerations behind the texts. Before my class, they view young adult books as enjoyable stories, but don't necessarily see them as anything more than that. This lack of grounding is a direct result of our literary culture, both in academia and out, treating YA literature as ephemeral and lacking social and historical relevance. Young adult stories can shape people for life. They often remain cherished for years after they are read to tatters. I have newer copies of multiple young adult books that I wore to pieces as an adolescent, including A Wrinkle in Time, The Witch of Blackbird Pond, some of those paperback Nancy Drews that I still have, The Westing Game, and The Piccolinis by Anne Graham Eastern. I still have my original copies of The Wolves of Willoughby Chase, of Mrs. Frisbee and the Rats of Nim, and the mixed-up files of Mrs. Basil E. Frankweiler, but they are creased and dog-eared and extremely well-loved. While YA is viewed as part of the constant churn of pop culture by most of the public, as fleeting as the music album or the television show of the moment, for many readers, the impact of YA texts is profound and lasting. It is this contradictory and dual nature of young adult literature that I am constantly negotiating as I teach. Reading and learning about YA lit enhances students' appreciation for the genre, its history, and for pop culture more broadly. Once students wrap their heads around the idea that YA literature is socially relevant, that YA texts teach their readers about social and cultural expectations, they are more willing to treat it seriously as literature and dissect exactly what each YA novel is teaching its readers and why. For example, the first text I taught this semester was Gary Eldon Peters' The Complicated Calculus and Cows of Carl Paulson. In one sense, this is a YA novel that could not have been written before the 21st century, given that there were very few young adult novels with LGBTQ characters published before the 1990s. Carl is an openly gay protagonist, one who lives in rural Minnesota and has his first sexual experiences with another male high school classmate, Andy. Andy is also the only other out person his own age that he has ever met. Carl gradually realizes that although he is attracted to Andy, their relationship and friendship is not exactly healthy and not meant to be long-term. At the same time, he's negotiating very adult problems in the form of grieving his recently dead mother and trying to support his father in running their struggling dairy farm. Carl ends the novel in a positive mental space, having come out to his father, his caretaker, who is more like his older sister, and one of his friends from school. He's given up his relationship with Andy and come to terms with his grief for his mother. My students often have a two-part reaction to this story. On the one hand, many of them have never read a young adult novel with an openly gay protagonist, and they discuss how Carl's story gives them perspective on what their LGBTQ classmates may have gone through in high school. For the handful of my students who are LGBTQ, they note how realistic and painful Carl's story feels, and how having Gary Eldon Peter write the novel helps them feel seen and validated. On the other hand, students often note how timeless other parts of Carl's story feel to them. Having a young adult novel set in a highly rural area is still fairly unusual for the genre, but many of my students grew up in a similarly rural area, the North Country of northern New York. Carl's world is a world they know. Rural, poor, agricultural, intertwined with dairy animals and the dairy industry, and lacking diversity because of its low population. All of the challenges Carl confronts in those areas are challenges they have confronted, or their parents and grandparents have confronted. Straight or LGBTQ, they have dealt with the poverty, isolation, and economic worry of rural agricultural life. While not all of them long to leave like Carl does, they understand the push and pull of wanting to follow their dreams to a life that is more fulfilling and more economically secure. And at the same time, they understand wanting to stay and fight for the animals and the farm that they consider their own. They want to stay and support their families, and at the same time want to build a life that is less difficult. All of this is to say that Carl's story is partly generational, something that my students could have heard from their parents or grandparents, a story they have also lived. However, it is also partly very contemporary, detailing the struggles of a young gay man in a rural area where he is isolated and without mentors. Those dual qualities of timeliness and timelessness are qualities that come up again and again in the YA novels that I teach, grounding students simultaneously in the contemporary and the historical. Let me give another example. The fourth novel that I currently teach is Justina Ireland's Dread Nation. This novel requires some heavy historical scaffolding for the students. While they know the basics of the Civil War, most of them know little to nothing about Reconstruction, and the vast majority of them are also not familiar with the history of Native American boarding schools, which Ireland used to create her combat schools in the novel. I have to give them grounding in those historical facts before Ireland's alternate timeline and story really starts to make sense to them. On the other hand, Ireland's story is also a fantasy of the dead having risen at Gettysburg, creating zombies known as shamblers, and a zombie apocalypse that only deepens the fight for survival between whites and the formerly enslaved. Zombie apocalypse stories are all over current popular culture, from the wildly popular Pride and Prejudice and Zombies to the long-running comic and television series of The Walking Dead to the more recent The Last of Us. My students are familiar with the tropes and storylines of zombie apocalypse media and frequently express amazement and delight at how well Ireland is able to transport them into a historical moment where they seem eerily appropriate. Having the historical grounding of Reconstruction and Native American boarding schools allows students to recognize and admire Ireland's skill with both history and contemporary sci-fi tropes, and how she merges them into something new. Nor does Ireland stop there. My students frequently recognize protagonist Jane McKean as someone who would identify as bisexual in modern terms, and her frenemy and eventual ally Catherine as being on the asexual spectrum. On the rare occasion that I get a student who is as obsessed with musical theater as I am, it is a delight to have them see the Rise Up tagline on Ireland's book cover and immediately link Ireland's storytelling to the same kind of historical and musical re-envisioning that Lin-Manuel Miranda accomplished in Hamilton. Like so much of young adult literature, Miranda's opus is simultaneously historical and of the current moment, speaking to the current culture as easily as it does to long-standing history. The two-sided approach to young adult literature that I have outlined here, considering both the contemporary and historical nature of young adult texts, is essential to my teaching practice. However, I think there are even deeper implications for how we approach all literature in the classroom. To turn to a far more troubling example, I do not teach any Laura Ingalls Wilder to my undergraduates. Her work makes for extremely difficult and sometimes traumatic reading for students. Ma's frequent allusions to hating Indians and Pa at one point appearing in blackface, to name just two painful narrative moments, are stark reminders of the racism that was pervasive and acceptable in Wilder's lifetime. What is more, the racism is neither acknowledged nor critiqued in the text, simply presented without comment, as indeed Wilder would have lived with it. While it can certainly be argued that reading and critiquing Wilder's racism and cultural biases in an undergraduate classroom is a valuable exercise in critical thinking, I also question whether holding these novels up as classic and timeless benefits anyone, most especially minority students who are still dealing with prejudice on a daily basis. Ireland makes a very pointed and detailed critique of Reconstruction racism and segregation, while Wilder does not even acknowledge the racism of her own period. Surely then, Ireland is the more valuable example of critiquing and reevaluating cultural norms. While I would gladly tackle Wilder's painful complexity in a graduate seminar, I believe more care and thoughtfulness is required in choosing texts for undergraduates, who do not necessarily have the life experience or the critical scaffolding to engage with work like Wilder's. Building that critical scaffolding is what undergraduate classes are for. Doing so in a way that is complex and engaging, but not re-traumatizing or prejudiced, is crucial to responsible pedagogy. To return to my opening, a book deal was announced this week for a series in which an adult Nancy Drew is now a 40-something divorced Brooklyn mom. In the first book, Nancy apparently must team with one of her childhood best friends to solve a case. I don't know if it's Bess or George. I'm dying to know. Whether she will successfully crack the mysterious adult book market remains to be seen, but it is another instance in which she remains timeless and as modern as can be. This gives every indication that her new books will be successful and find as many cheerfully willing readers as her teen adventures did.
Thank you very much, Dr.
Yes,
Hamilton Honey.
thank you.
And to finish us off, we have Dr. J. VanderVeen presenting rule number 22, when in doubt, know your way out, or how we can learn from zombies.
Thank you, Dr. Gibson. And I think Nancy Drew is going to be a podcaster and do true crime and link all of this back together again. Be fantastic. Let me share my screen. There we go, and move this other stuff out of the way. Cool. My name is Jay VanderVeen. I'm a professor of anthropology at Indiana University in South Bend, Indiana. I'm not a literature professor in any way, but because an anthropologist tells the story of people and talks about their own mythologies, I feel it's appropriate that I can sort of shoehorn my way into the rest of this conversation. So let me begin by starting with this. Religions and folk tales make use of proxies of human beings to provide an example for the proper behavior of the real thing. Deities, spirits, souls and ghosts, angels and demons, giants and elves. They're enough like us to be familiar, but enough unlike us to be imbued with supernatural traits. Like other fantastical creatures, zombies are an extension of what we recognize as human. So I'm going to be talking about the human with Dr. Gibson, and the zombies, of course, rear their dead heads in this one as well. These zombies were human before taking on this new aspect, although they're really treated as such after they've turned, and for this reason, we get to place rules on them about how to be human. They take many forms in which their learning exists. They are a tabula rasa, a blank slate that illustrates the fears of their time. They are fables, or instruments in the teaching of the young, and reinforcing important aspects to the adults. And like lenses, they're elements that reflect and amplify the understanding of social mores. They are perspective through which we can better make sense of the natural world around us, even though they are supernatural creatures. And they stand in for aspects of society and culture that legitimately cause us distress and fear. Zombies, whether they're real or not, create these social categories that organize our world. And as such, university professors can exploit them and safely discuss controversial issues or encourage students in the practice of a task. So I'm going to explain how, not necessarily what, we can learn from zombies. In the 2000, oh my God, it's so long ago, it's hard to say. In the 2009 film Zombieland, there are 33 rules explained by the main character. I'm not going to reference those specifically. They're easily found on Google or, by watching the film, and not necessary really the point here. But rule number 22, I skipped ahead too quick. When in doubt, know your way out is a perfect metaphor for today's talk because it's talking about these monsters. It's rehearsing our escape plans for our own real world anxieties. One other crucial point must be raised here. I'm talking solely about Hollywood, quote unquote, zombies, those that are created as works of fiction, not the folkloric tradition of dead or nearly dead
but
people.
we read for pleasure. There's some.
There we go. Lost that guy. That are created as a work of fiction, not the folkloric tradition that many cultures hold to be true. So the Hollywood version of zombies is, let's be honest, a misappropriation of Haitian spiritual ontology. That history is rich, it's complex, and it's deserving of its own deep study. So my own professor in graduate school authored a paper in 1985 on ancient Maya and the political present. He suggested that the research done by scholars on the cause and decline of the classic Maya civilization reflected not the data, but the era in which the research was done. The data don't change drastically. It's the social context of their analysis that strongly influences the result. Zombie stories can be the same way. Their creation is from a clean slate. They have no free will, only the drive to consume flesh. It's their experiences and the impression of the authors that we can see when the pen meets the paper or the director calls action. Zombies change through time to stand in for our own fears. They are monsters that register humanity's social anxiety. They are products of our times. So I don't need to tell you the history of the genre, but I do need to show how I present it to the students. Not as a list of movies, but as a timeline of American culture and anxiety. By tracing the evolution of the atomic fears of the Cold War to the viral pandemics of the modern blockbuster, we turn this pop culture into an anthropological and historical archive. For instance, we can look at Night of the Living Dead from 1968, not as a creature feature, but as a text on civil rights and Vietnam-era nihilism. We can read World War Z not as an action thriller, but a critique of a global bureaucratic failure. We can analyze The Walking Dead not for the gore, although that's fun too, but for its obsession with the collapse of the nuclear family. By grounding the course in these specific cultural touchstones, students realize that we're not just watching movies, we're reading the diary of the American psyche. This allows students to see that their favorite horror franchises are a very sophisticated mirror reflecting the specific trauma of their time. To be fair, scholars and critics tend to focus only on a few high-profile, big-budget, widely released movies that are not necessarily representative of the broader genre. These films are meaningful due to their popularity, not necessarily the assumptions that they make when they were selected as representatives of the whole. So there's a sampling bias in that research. But for every 28 days later, there are dozens of straight-to-video B movies with zombies signifying nothing much more than a writer's search for a buck. I choose the term fables here to describe the ways in which zombies are used to instruct. Unlike the other narrative techniques, a fable is usually focused on a non-human character, like an animal or a supernatural being, or even an animated object. That character, here played by a zombie, conveys a moral, and it teaches us humans what we need to do. The US government received a lot of press for choosing zombies as the vehicle through which to convey the moral of always being prepared. The Centers for Disease Control usually get like 1,000 hits per day on their website. When they posted a zombie readiness plan, their servers could not keep up with the traffic. They tapped into a cultural zeitgeist and they surfed, like faculty do, on this wave of zombie popularity. And then the Defense Department did the same thing. Training programs were created around the threat of a zombie epidemic. When asked by the press, the officers went on record saying this was not intended to be a joke. It was a conscious decision to pick zombies as the enemy instead of a real country, an actual nation, to avoid any diplomatic issues. And it was easier than creating their own fake scenario of an unknown disease or an astronomical or geological disaster. Skip ahead, please. Thank you. So that success led to an imitation by state governments and other institutions. Everywhere you looked, there were zombie walks and zombie months and zombie drills, and it all focused on how to show any danger, food insecurity, lack of vaccinations. Smart humans who wished to avoid becoming zombies would do whatever the prescribed activity was. Other fields also found themselves subsumed by this zombie horde. Although zombies are fictional, they do respond to and comment on reality. They become a lens through which we can learn about the world around us. They reflect and they make clear. Teachers are using programs installed on calculators that teach math through zombie modules. Books are sold that employ, quote, zombie-based learning that meet state educational standards. It proves that whether we're discussing elementary school students or bank regulators, the age of the audience is irrelevant. It's the metaphor that works. The legitimacy given to these creatures stems from their use as analogies, their ubiquity, and the way they're so readily applicable to whatever it is that the audience already understands. Rule 22, know your way out, calls for us to move from passive observers, whether it's in the world or in the classroom, to active participants. We have to be aware of our environment, whether it's physical or political, and we have to make mindful decisions. The metaphor here works because you cannot be neutral about a zombie. You must either join them or outsmart them. Finally, because the after effects of natural disasters and refugee crises and war and terrorism so closely resemble the scenarios of zombie movies, fiction can stand in for reality in a palatable or a safer way. Zombies can be a surrogate or a substitute for real people affected by these horrors. And it lessens the mental and emotional trauma of thinking about these terrible things that are happening to other people. I was inspired to use zombies as a proxy in a class I taught. After, of all things, reading a story, it's only 3 paragraphs long, and it fits on the back of a Chipotle soft drink cup. The story is called 2 Minutes to Run, and it concerns refugees fleeing their homes. It does not really matter what makes them leave. It can be a war, an outbreak of a disease, a fire, a flood. As I read this cup, my thoughts turned to a zombie invasion. And regardless of the situation, those affected must grab whatever they can and go. Students could relate to this urgency on a personal level, even more than they might to a new story about the same crisis. We often struggle to get students to discuss heavy topics like refugee displacement or pandemic response because the reality is too raw. This is where a zombie can fill in as a pedagogical buffer. We focus on fiction and we lower the emotional stakes. Students aren't debating current politics, and that could make them defensive. They're debating survival strategies. And once they commit to the logic of the zombie world, we can sneak in real world sociology and anthropology without them putting their guard up. So like Liz mentioned, I also created a sort of upper level course. This one was on the anthropology of zombies. And it was really a way to bring in students and teach them about the field of anthropology and the current events of the world in a classic bait and switch format. They thought they were going to learn about study zombies, and instead they learned about all of these really big things. For instance, they learned about the interdisciplinary nature on the study of culture. We did not just watch movies. We analyzed how geography dictates the spread of the horde. We looked at philosophical questions on the ethics of survival and what it means to be human. We brought in literature professors to deconstruct the narrative arc. They challenged the students to compare the quote-unquote oral history format of World War Z to the real-world war reporting, saying things like, who gets to tell the story of the end of the world? We used the zombie archetype to discuss the other in literature, comparing the mindless horde to the treatment of the monster in Frankenstein or Grendel in Beowulf. It forced undergraduates to apply 19th century literary theory to 21st century pop culture. And this frames that hero's journey amid the undead. I also taught them how to use the ethnographic method. I assigned them to attend a local zombie walk. They thought they were just there to have fun. The switch here was the assignment. They had to conduct an ethnography. They had to map the demographics of the horde, the people there. They had to categorize the costume choices. They had to interview participants about why they chose to enact death in a public space. So they learned participant observation, not by reading in a textbook, by actually embedding themselves into the swarm. And then finally, I taught them the survival skill that scares anthropologists and other humanists the most, grant writing. So rather than playing a role-playing game about supplies or something, I raised the stakes to reality. Students had to write a full legitimate grant proposal following the strict guidelines of the VanderVeen Foundation. Their task was to design a feasible anthropological project to study the supernatural, whether it's the roots of voodoo, the subculture of cryptid hunters, or the sociology of the undead. They learned that the real horror is not the monster. It's articulating methodology rigorous enough to get funded. It taught them that in academia, as in the apocalypse, if you cannot articulate your value, you do not survive. So as an audience, we are like zombies in that we consume voraciously what it is that we like. The difference is we humans do not do so mindlessly. We have free will. We possess agency. We can and do interpret culture actively. We swallow the cultural tropes, but we also digest them and take with us what we need as nourishment. We grow, we learn, we reflect. So my conclusion is that reaching the public or students, just as the defense against the undead, you must always aim for their head. Zombies are mindless, but they do give us a lot to think about. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. VanderVeen. We have 20 minutes left for a discussion before we get to that, and I'm gonna actually cede most of that to all of you because obviously the voice is still gone. I want to point out that Dr. VanderVeen was my professor for quite a while at Indiana University South Bend and only launched his zombie-based senior capstone after I left, which massively honked me off, which is why I insisted that he and I write together on the topic of zombies, which was super fun. So, by all means, discuss, and I will pop in with questions if we slow down.
Rebecca, I know you just said that your voice is dying, but I do have a question for you, which is, do you teach your class online or in person? And how does that, if online, how does the digital interface kind of fit in with some of the things that you work on in there?
So the decision was made to teach this class in person, and that was
Okay.
mostly because of permissions issues. A lot of the material that I was wanting to show the students was on multiple different streaming platforms. It is impossible nowadays to stream things through Zoom, which
Yep.
is really, really frustrating. Um, and I didn't want to turn that burden over to the students. I'm fine making them buy a whole bunch of books. I didn't want them to have to pay for 4 months of 5 different streaming services. Um, we are trying to make the anthropology program at VCU something you can take entirely online. We haven't quite worked out how to do that with higher level electives or things that work with labs yet.
Mm.
If you all have any suggestions, I'm actually
Yeah,
in
I was
charge
gonna
of
say because
developing
of
that.
the film studies program that we're launching, I would love to keep chatting with you about it because I have the
Yeah.
exact same problem of how do we get students access to the texts that they need without having them pay for streaming.
Yeah, I'm
Anyway,
in
thank
charge
you.
of developing that online program, so I have no
Sweet.
clue.
Okay. Rebecca, there's a question for you in the chat. How are you and or your students discussing AI within your courses?
That is also a very good question. So, in terms of using AI for for the things that they turn in the course, my main um, point of argument was absolutely not. Like everything you turn in has to come from yourself. Thankfully, it was a course that was set up in order to facilitate them, mostly with discussion, upper level elective, literature students, and anthropology students. They like it has to come from your head, and they were fine with that. In terms of the ethics of AI, we kind of weave that into the discussion of what the material itself is showing. And again, things were mixed. It all comes down to that question of ethical uses. Can you find any, are there any is still up for debate? If you can, how can we combat this overwhelming capacity for corruption by people who are doing it unethically? So we talked about it, but we did not use it within the class.
Can I do a shameless self-promotion and say that I teach an entire class on robots in science fiction? And we talk pretty extensively about AI in there. And I have a brand new AI ethics course coming up in the fall where we're going to tackle all of these issues and for sure bring in some pop culture to think about it. So it's top of everyone's mind.
Yay, that sounds awesome.
I oh sorry, Jake, go ahead. No, you go.
This is a question for each of you. It came up directly with Emily's and indirectly with mine. The idea of what a scholar of literature or culture needs to do when addressing a creator who has, let's say, ethical issues. So mine was Neil Gaiman was on the cup, and Laura Ingalls
Yeah.
Wilder was brought up, and I'm sure not everything about the Wachowski is appreciated by everybody in each of these groups. So what do you all feel about the canceling of artists, or is it more of the contextualization of the artists?
I think for me it depends, which is sort of I think what Emily was getting at as well is um, challenging the canon. I think is super duper important in everything we do.
Mhm.
Um, with true crime specifically, one of the conversations we have a lot in class is why are all these books by white people about white people when disproportionately the prison system in the US affects people of color? So that opens up big conversations. But typically, I don't teach a lot of texts in that class that are even by people of color. And some of the early tech, like In Cold Blood, has some wildly racist material in it. That's not like Truman Capote doesn't do any kind of commentary on it. He just sort of presents it. And so then we can have those conversations about how he's presenting like true characters in there. But in other situations, like one of the big conversations we have in film studies is do you teach Birth of a Nation? And should you teach Birth of a Nation, which is classically about the creation of the KKK. It is laudatory of the KKK and just one of the most horrifyingly racist films you'll ever see. And some people are on the side of no, we need to leave that part of our history out. And some of us are on the side of we need to show clips of it so that students know this is our history and we need to address it really clearly. Um, so again, it's really about like what are the goals of your course and the students you have in front of you, I think, the other problem.
Blade Runner has the N-word within the first 10 minutes, something I routinely forget before I show it in class. So, because like you don't, that is not a situation where you are anticipating hearing that word. And also, none of that is present in the book from which it comes. So, I mean, there's classism, there is racism, but there's not like that overt slur usage. The slurs are directed towards the androids. So, what I said straight away in my class on transhumanism is that the usage of these particular terms is within a specific context, and we can and will discuss the context within the class, but presenting material that contains racism, sexism, classism, homophobia, etc., is not endorsing that. It is specifically using material that is flawed, as is pretty much everything in the world, to demonstrate a specific point, and we can talk about all of that inclusive of the class.
Yeah, I think I tend to agree with Liz that it would depend very much who I was teaching and what the point was, right? If I was teaching grad students, I probably would teach Wilder precisely because she's incredibly problematic. And then you add in all the things that Rose Wilder Lane did to her manuscripts and the fact that Rose was one of the founding members of the Libertarian Party, and there's like all of this weirdness around Wilder that is definitely worth unpacking. Um, would I do it for undergraduate students? No. Like my undergraduate students, I would say most of them are not familiar enough with Wilder and not familiar enough with literary analysis in general to feel anything but really uncomfortable if I were to hand them a Wilder text, right? And so with this particular young adult literature class, which is a 300 level class, I try to pull in texts that still address social issues, that show tons of diversity of various, you know, racial diversity, LGBTQ diversity, economic diversity, all of these things, um, but that isn't addressing them in a way that has the potential to really upset students, right? The texts address those things in ways that lend themselves to students learning to analyze, rather than getting caught up in, this is offensive, this is hurtful, this is re-traumatizing, this is, all of these different things that students tend to experience.
We have a question for Liz in the chat.
Yeah, the question is, where do you find academic writing about true crime, and how do you decide what recent events are important enough to include in the course? So academic work is starting to get published on true crime. Historically, like all the classic texts I talked about, scholars have been publishing about them for a long time. So it's pretty easy to find pieces on that. There are a couple of really great books that have recently come out that I think were both dissertations first. So you can see that true crime is now in the academic life cycle of, people are starting to pick it up for their doctoral work. The Charlotte Barnes book is excellent, and that author actually covers all of the classic texts as well. So I'm able to pull chapters from there. I'm going to plug a friend, which is Dr. Rebecca Frost, writes about true crime. Her work is amazing. She also does work with PCA on true crime. So it's around. You kind of have to dig for it, but it's doable. And we're at a point right now when the amount of literature on true crime is fairly manageable. I expect in 5 years it will be overwhelming, much like teaching a zombie class or a robots class. And as far as newer stuff comes in, I don't include any new work. I let my students bring that in, and they do. They get really excited about, like, oh, did you watch this new Netflix documentary? Oh, did you listen to this podcast? And so I leave it on them to make those connections. And it's such a popular genre right now that they're all so excited to be talking about it and so excited to be interacting with it, that I don't really have to do that work, thankfully. Emily has her hand up.
So I actually had kind of a joint question for Jay and Rebecca, because Rebecca, you were talking about sort of the permeability of what is human and the limits of being human and how technology extends our humanness. And it struck me that maybe, Jay, there's some relevance to your work on zombies as well. Like, does talking about zombies, kind of like talking about the Matrix, does it challenge your students in terms of how they think about what is human? Like, how do zombies fit into that what is human or not discussion?
So I challenge my students with this question in all of my classes as an anthropologist, and we study what it means to be human. In fact, there's the title of my intro level gen ed course that's just becoming human. And it addresses this issue of where do we draw that line? Is a chimpanzee human? Can it be a Homo erectus, a Homo neanderthal? What significant thing sets us apart from all of the other species? And then these upper level classes, we do the same thing. What significantly sets us apart from people who are dead? Are dead people still human? Are robots? Are cyborgs? All of this is the idea of, is it love? Is it cooking? Is it the thought of ourselves? Is it a bad dad joke? Which of those things do only humans do? So Rebecca and I have sort of negotiated some of these questions ourselves and what it means for our students to think about humanity, because then they're reflecting on themselves. And then it brings up issues of disability studies even. Once you replace a part of you with a machine, have you lost that humanity? And obviously the question is the answer for most of us is going to be no, but it makes them think more about what is important to them and the things that they want to project forward, even outside of the stuff they learn in the class.
We've also addressed that in our first co-edited volume together, in which we wrote about zombies and gender, specifically from the book World War Z, which is far different from the movie World War Z, where we talk about like both gender bias in the writing, in that there's only about six of the people who are talked about who are female in the World War Z timeline, but also the dehumanization of zombies and their sort of neutralization into, excuse me, into the Walking Dead, into these things instead of people.
Thank you both. That's awesome. So there was
Question.
there was a question for me in the chat that said, how did you find the text that you talk about, and how do you decide which modern texts to talk about? So, young adult literature is its own scholarly specialty. Um, and when I'm working in that particular group of scholars, I tend to crowdsource. A few semesters ago, I decided to completely overhaul the young adult literature course. I assigned all new texts, which I don't recommend doing that in like the same semester. By the way, that was a mistake. Like assigning seven totally new novels in a semester was not something I should have done. But when I was looking for texts, I specifically knew that I was looking for texts that would represent different kinds of diversity. And I crowdsourced. As I remember, I put a post out on Facebook, and said, young adult lit colleagues, what are you teaching? What's going to get me, what's a good young adult book about disability? What's a good young adult book about rural life? What's a good young adult book that covers ethnicity or multiple books, right? And people had all kinds of suggestions, some of which I'd heard of and some of which I hadn't. I had never, until a colleague suggested it, I had never heard of complicated calculus in cows. And then I read it and absolutely fell in love with it. It's just a lovely novel, very poignant. Gary Eldon Peter is himself a gay man who grew up in a rural area, so it's very true to his experience. Um, and yeah, so I ended up with a lot of texts that I wasn't familiar with, but that allowed me to talk about different kinds of diversity with the students. Dread Nation was one of the ones I actually had heard of. And I wanted something new to talk about young adult apocalyptic fiction. Um, and it happened to fit the bill really well. Um, and Ireland is brilliant. She's a great writer. I think the way that she incorporates both the historical and the contemporary is amazing, and the students really start digging into that once we start analyzing. Um, so yeah, it's really fun. I'm always looking for new things. And the students who do know young adult lit, which is not a lot of them, but the ones who do, who have read extensively or who have kids who read extensively, are always giving me suggestions, right? And saying, "Oh, have you read this? Have you read this? This would be really cool." So that's fun as well.
I
The
want to
list
point
is
out, oh,
endless.
I want to point out something that will sort of bring everything together as we have 1 minute left, which is that we all bring things into our separate disciplines, to our separate topics, and we are all focused on that idea of the new, the representative, the what have you. And it really like focuses in on what Emily was talking about and Nancy Drew always being new. And I love the way they do that, which is Carolyn Keene is not one person.
Ugh,
Carolyn Keene is multitudes. So you get
multitudes of people.
this refreshing of perspective and knowledge and relative relativistic stuff every single time you get a new Carolyn Keene. I have met one of them. Susan Wittig Albert was Carolyn Keene. So, all right, thank you all so very much, and thank you for the conference for hosting us. It was great to have you all here.
Yes, this was awesome. It was so great to chat with you all and just hear about everything you're working on. And now I'm having like a million thoughts about how all of this is connected.
Bye, everybody.